Few philosophers have more obviously changed the world than Hegel, both personally through his influence on German nationalism and indirectly through the work of his most famous philosophical disciple, Karl Marx, after whom a great many governments in our own day actually call themselves. So if we want to see some of the practical consequences of Hegel's ideas, all we have to do is look at the world in which we ourselves live.
Our culture is immersed in relativism. What is relativism? And can you discern it? We'll explore this and more on this edition of Life Matters. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives, as California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California Pro-Life Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life, on the values and the culture that have emanated from that singular idea, the idea that you have a life that was given to you by a creator. It wasn't given to you by society. It wasn't given to you by the government. It is your creator that gave you your life, but there is a role for government, and our founder said the role for government is to ensure your right to be alive, to ensure that your life isn't taken from you by someone else or even the government itself unless you've had due process of law. The idea of the right to life is essential to understanding human freedom in America because it's the ideas behind the American experiment that have brought freedom throughout the world. And I've been in many parts of this world. I was in New Zealand when a gentleman there admitted to me he felt that the freedoms they had in New Zealand, in Australia, and that part of the world were guaranteed by the citizen soldiers of the United States who fought for the idea that human individuals should be protected under just a government. And this is an important idea. The reason we spend time on the right to life right now is that it's at stake. It's an idea that's being brought into question. It has been brought into question other times in human history by unjust governments. But even the government of the United States now has begun to question whether the right to life should be applied to all individual human beings, that there might be classes of human beings that could be dismissed. We saw that in 1973, where the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton that an unborn child didn't have the right to life. That would no longer be extended, even though every state in the nation had protection for that child in the womb. All the 50 laws in the 50 states were overturned by that Supreme Court pair of decisions, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. And it's because of that that the right to life movement really came into existence to again assert this basic premise. But more to the point, that battle is raging right now, and human lives are being lost because there's other categories of people that are now being dismissed. Those who have an illness, a terminal illness perhaps, or perhaps they're simply incurable. Perhaps they're depressed and incurable. Well, that particular class of human beings, they're being discarded now, even in the United States of America, and legally so. That is frightening. And unless you understand this battle of ideas is really about individual lives, you're going to lose this battle. So I know many people that are pro-life and they do mourn the individual lives lost. I have friends who have had abortions and they now deeply regret those abortions. I used to teach high school and I saw students of mine who would just be crushed because they had had an abortion. And it's a human cost here, the cost of that child's life, but the cost to that human individual. And many of you are involved in counseling and encouraging young women, and that's a good thing. But I tell you, if we don't address the battle of ideas and the laws that are allowing this, you'll be counseling a lot more women. And this carnage is going to continue unless we address this very real battle of ideas. And the reason we often talk about laws on Life Matters is because laws are basically ideas that are enforced. So we want to encourage you to be aware of ideas, and they're not scary. You do have to take time to think about them, and the right to life is based on that premise, that there's an essential idea behind a just society. And in our society, it is that every individual has been given a gift by God. Sometimes we'll talk a little bit about theology, but not a lot. And if we do, it's as deep as the theology on the back of your money. If you're listening in America, every coin and every dollar bill you have says there's a God. That's pretty cool because what the founder said and what nature says is that there is a God. Somebody designed all of this. And if you want to make sense of what this is that we live in, the reality that surrounds us, you have to look at the fact that there's an ordered universe. And if we want to have just laws, we want to follow the laws that are represented in the laws of nature and of nature's God. And that's what our founders did. So if you're joining us by radio, these last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the conflict of ideas between natural law, the laws of nature and of nature's God, and the idea that truth and laws, well, they're all relative. And where did that come from? Last week, we spoke in depth about Hegel and how Hegel is a leading philosopher in changing the worldview of Western society. And we did some deep analysis on that. It wasn't complex. If you'd like to go to the podcast, I've already had folks tell me that they really appreciated understanding why Hegel was so important and how Hegel has infected our own view. It isn't just that he spawned National Socialism, that's Nazism, and International Socialism, that's communism. Hegelian view of history and of reality infects our culture right now. And I'm going to spend a little more time talking about that. I wish if you could read some writings of Justice Antonin Scalia or Justice Clarence Thomas, two justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. Antonin Scalia has since passed away, but he was great in bringing these things down to earth and was well known for presenting these principles in a humorous way. But in reality, what a Supreme Court justice is he's just talking about ideas and which ideas should be applied to the law. So Antonin Scalia is just a great source on these types of things. But a lot of us don't have time to read that. I understand. We're listening to the radio or we, turn on the television or the computer. We love watching videos. People have said we should make Life Matters a video presentation. Well, we're not doing that. But you can listen in your car. You can listen to the podcast. You can listen on the radio wherever you are. And we want to equip you for this battle of ideas because lives are at stake. So in just a little bit, we're going to come back. I'm going to pick up again why Hegel is so dangerous to us. Right now, where you are, even if you don't see yourself as a Hegelian philosopher, even if you've never heard the name Hegel, this worldview has infected America as well. It's infected all of Western thinking. And we're going to take just a little more time in explaining progressivism's infectious nature, its religious nature, its spiritually dynamic. It's a fetching and attractive view of history. It appeals to our sense of destiny. That's really exciting. And we're going to talk about why it's really dangerous too.
Life Matters continues after this.
Well, hi. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. I have good friends, children, young adults, and adults that have Down syndrome. And they are so loved. Their parents love them so much because they're the happiest people you'd ever want to know. I really love them. I'm going to tell you something, though, that's rather frightening. The government of France has now prohibited showing positive images of Down syndrome children and letting parents know how lovable they are. That's an actual law in France. Here in the U.S., 80-some-odd% of Down syndrome kids are killed by abortion before they're born. In France, it's 96%. So we're not a whole lot better. If you'd like to help out, you can go to the National Down Syndrome Society, ndss.org, to help out. That's ndss.org. We really are in a battle of ideas, and lives really are at stake.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Well, welcome back. As I said, we're talking about the battle of ideas, and we're spending time, again, with why Hegel has infected our own worldview. It's not just that he inspired communism. It's not just that he inspired National Socialism, which destroyed millions of lives. It's infected our own worldview. And if you didn't hear that particular episode, do go back on the podcast. You can listen to it. It'll explain Hegel's philosophy quickly. Hegel believes that history has a flow and a purpose, and that it's spiritually animated. There is a Geist, a spirit to history, and it's moving us forward to a brave new world of freedom. And it's the conflict of ideas that moves history forward. So conflict is really good. And that's, of course, why revolutionaries, they basically are inspired by the Hegelian view that they're moving history forward. They're giving a sense of destiny to all of mankind. it's important. And so they're moving this forward to their brave new world of better ideas. But there's a cost, and we'll spend some time in the cost. And again, if you've studied National Socialism or communism, you know that the real cost is in human lives. Because what Hegel does is empower the state. And that's where a lot of progressives, they tend to skip that part. But they're really statists. And what they tend to do when they see an injustice, and by the way, there are injustices. That's why we need government. That's why we need to have courts and trial courts. We need to find out what's true. But the cool thing, you might say, in a free society is that each individual case of injustice needs to be examined. That the individual who is either a victim or a perpetrator, we need to examine what happened. We need to hold individuals accountable. What tends to happen if you're a Hegelian progressive is that injustices are not held to account to individuals. And in fact, in many ways, because of Hegel's view of history, it's society that's to be held to account. It's society that's moving forward, and the only way to change things is to change the whole society. And so what'll happen is that individuals, well, those are just you're incidental. And again, in the Hegelian view of history, and you can look at it in Marx, you can look at it in what happened in any National Socialist fascist system, is that individuals are dismissed, and they're only valuable if they're progressing with the state to a better state. That's where individuals find their identity. Their spirit is in the zeitgeist, mit der Staat, the state, that the government embodies history and the flow of history. And so it's groupthink. Everything's done with groups. So individuals aren't held accountable for injustice. It's society that needs to be put on trial. It's society that needs to change. And you will hear this appeal time and again. Very often, what progressives tend to do is they'll have many injustices, and they want them all addressed with the idea, if you're changing government, well, then we'll just do a big fix. We'll just change our form of government to address all these injustices. Again, I'm encapsulating our two discussions. Before we talked about Hegel, we talked about natural law. We talked about the fact that truth can be observed, that truth is knowable, and talk to any mathematician. Mathematicians that I know, they really are amazed at how God has designed the universe because it's knowable, and it amazes people that spend time. I'll be honest with you, I'm not really good with math. But if I spent the time, if you spend the time, it is observable. And that's one of the benefits of math and true science, is if you spend time and think about what's at stake. Natural law says that you can know what's true, that you can see in nature. And true science, not politicized science. Again, a lot of people will invoke that word science as a magic shibboleth, as an incantation. Well, I'm a scientist, and therefore what I'm saying is right. No, science can be used as a cudgel and have nothing based in truth, but if they say it's scientific, then suddenly they're all powerful. No, there is objective science, and objective science means it can be questioned, should be questioned, and that's why good scientists continually test, and good scientists discuss things more deeply. And it's clear what science says is that there's really much more to learn. Now, that isn't what progressives say. They dismiss the immediacy of science, and they go with conjectured science about the future. And so the idea that we're going to fix the future sounds very attractive. Listen to this young woman. She's very compelling. She believes in the future. She believes that she's thinking scientifically and that the future will change everything, and all the groups who have been violated, well, everything will be made right if we can only change our form of government.
I am so incredibly excited that we are going to transition this country into the future, and we are not going to be dragged behind by our past. I'm so excited for families who have been enduring the injustices of drinking dirty water, or who have seen their living rooms being flooded in with the waves of rising sea levels. And today, I think, is a really big day for our economy, the labor movement, the social justice movement, indigenous peoples, and people all over the United States of America. Because today is the day that we truly embark on a comprehensive agenda of economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America. That's what this agenda is all about. Because climate change and our environmental challenges are one of the biggest existential threats to our way of life, not just as a nation, but as a world.
So what we see is there's an appeal to those who are emotionally committed to a sense of Hegelian progressivism. Activists is what they're called. And that's what they were called in revolutionary times. That's what they were called way back in the time of Hegel. They were doers. They're going to do something to fix it, and they're going to change the form of government. And a lot of times they'll band together and have different conflicting ideas. The problem that Hegel created with these followers, and you saw it in Nazi Germany, you saw it in Stalin's Russia, is that a lot of true believers want to keep going, that there's no end to the revolution. And so that's a problem that Stalin had. If you know the story of Stalin and Trotsky, once you believe this religion, you've got to keep going. And you got to keep setting things right. Stalinists and certain other followers, and in America, there were followers of Stalin. You may not know that, but there were quite a few that believed this because in some ways, this idea of progress has actually been taught in our school system. As I mentioned last time, the ideas of progressivism and relativism, while dominant in the 19th century, by the time the 20th century rolled around, they very much influenced American thinking as well. And what tends to happen is people will blend their cultural values with a progressive worldview of history, and they'll blend them together and not recognize that. That's what's known as a syncretism. So I'll be perfectly honest with you, in American history, I actually am a big fan of Theodore Roosevelt. He was an amazing president, but he had, in fact, for all of his sense of purpose, he had also included an element of progressivism and the idea that history itself is flowing in a direction and our purpose is to direct that flow, that humanity's purpose is to direct history and it gives you spiritual purpose. And part of the problem with progressivism is ultimately it contains within it a seed of anti-individualism. That is to say, as much as Theodore Roosevelt was an individualist, he more importantly wanted to form government that was moving everything forward, and he tended to dismiss certain individuals. And you may not know this, but the fact is that Theodore Roosevelt was in fact a eugenicist. And a eugenicist is someone who believes that people that don't have good genes are inferior human beings, and therefore, based on that, they should not reproduce. And you should only have good genetic folks reproducing for the future. And you're dismissing a whole category of human lives. Now, he didn't go as far as some eugenicists. It was very popular, by the way, at the turn of the 20th century. And Adolf Hitler was basically embracing that in his form of government, as you know. And he didn't start with the Jews. He started with what was known as the T4 program. That's where they started, and it started immediately. In 1933, the Nazis started cleansing the Germanic culture of inferior people. And Germans who had bad genes were eliminated, literally killed. And that was the beginning of the death camps. They started in certain institutions where there were people that were intellectually incapacitated. They also killed World War I vets who were now older, mustard gas victims. They were incurable. They cost the society a lot of money. They would never help society move forward. They were considered less humans, and they could be killed out of compassion. And that's documented widely. It's called the T4 program. It began in 1933 in the name of compassion. They were killing human beings in the name of compassion for the sake of society. And so what happens with progressivism, because it's about society and government change, and if there's an injustice, you have to deal with the group and with society and not individuals. It tends to dismiss human lives. And you see that time and again, and you're seeing it now in the United States. So it isn't just communism. It isn't just National Socialism. There are people who will embrace it as part of their culture. And that's where it gets very dangerous because it blends with other ideas you have. In National Socialism, I know Germans that lived through that, and they love the German culture. And there's some cool things to actual German culture, by the way. I think every culture in the world is very fascinating. But they would blend National Socialism with these Germanic values, even their language, and this became a problem, as you know. And in the case of Russia, they basically blended this idea of a brave new world of communism with the serfs and with the common Russian people. Right now, China is doing that. China literally is blending communism outright Marxism, they're blending that with Confucianism, who was, as you know, Confucius was a Chinese philosopher. He was not a Marxist, but they're blending it and making it the same thing. This is very common, this syncretism with our own world to bring in progress as an idea that we're going towards my favored world, and it's extremely dangerous.
Life Matters continues after this.
They say sunlight is the best disinfectant. Did you know that California has a law in the books that says you need to protect babies born alive in the course of an abortion? But that law is simply ignored. The current legislature and Governor Newsom's administration support all abortions all the time. And they simply do not examine or regulate the practice, even though our tax dollars pay for it. We need to shine a light on this cover-up of the abortion industry in our state. Go to californiaprolife.org and click on the Light of Day project. We need the facts about late-term abortion to be examined and made known. We need the government doing its job to protect lives. We need the light of day on this. Go to californiaprolife.org.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Okay, well, we're back. Here are two philosophers, one from Australia and one from the UK, so listen through their accents. They're talking about the applicability of Hegel to everything in our culture. Everything from theology to history to law to philosophy. Every aspect of Hegel is being applied to our culture right now.
The influence that Hegel had is not just an influence in philosophy. It's an influence in theology, in history, in politics, in economics even, in law. Now, the fact that Hegel's ideas could be applied in those ways shows how fruitful his approach, and particularly the historical elements of his approach, were. Because it was that historical idea of things as having developed, as being a process, that could be applied by scholars in all these different areas.
That was Australian philosopher Peter Singer. This now is British philosopher Brian McGee. He's explaining that with Hegel, it's a formula that anyone can use. And he refers to solving for X. And X is whatever you want the future to be.
If Marx has taken over a great long set of equations from Hegel, substituted a different value for X in the equations, matter instead of mind, but kept the whole set of equations in every other respect the same.
So you might consider yourself a very noble person, but you're willing to fight for a change in government and willing to fight groups of people because you want X to come about. You want to stop global warming. You want to stop animal cruelty. You want to address the injustice of the redistribution of wealth, whatever it might be. And so you can put that as your ultimate goal. That is your ultimate goal. Solve for X. And you just adopt Hegelian worldview of progress and say, look, we're progressing towards that. What I'm doing is good. It's the Geist. It's the spirit of what we need to do. And you see this philosophy also in terms of this corporate spirit. It's very similar. And I know people who believe that George Lucas's Force, the whole Star Wars theology, and they created a theology in Star Wars. And there's not a specific God. It's a generic destiny-oriented God. It's the Force, and it's the conflict, the dark side and the light side. It's very similar to Hegelian worldview. There's a lot of Americans, and polls have been done. There's Americans who say that's their actual faith. And what they're saying is that they believe Hegel. They never heard of Hegel. But what Lucas was doing was taking certain Eastern mysticism and Hegelian ideas about the zeitgeist and the Geist and combining that. And that's a very infectious worldview because it spiritualizes our lives. It means that we can have a purpose if we're engaged now in this conflict of history. We're moving it forward. We can animate it. We can be not on the dark side, but on the light side. We can fight for what's right. And that's an attractive idea. But it misses the fact that the truth is already known, that we're not going somewhere. We're here. You've been created right now, and the truth can be known right now. And when it comes to injustices, it's important to address injustices as they take place, which is why we have a system now, and we're blessed with it, a court system where you hold the individual responsible for the objective facts. where you deal with objective facts right now. The conjectured truth, the synthetic truth, again, it's a synthesis that Hegel brings us about the future. That's what matters to people when they become progressives. It's the future, and it justifies whatever I do to change things. And even if the science they invoke, and we've talked about this before, the science of Greenpeace, it was originally founded by a scientist, Dr. Patrick Moore. And he left Greenpeace because he said they're liars. They're anti-science. They say they're invoking science, but they don't. They make up their own science to sound good. In a sense, that's what Hegel himself did. He wanted to explain history, and he gave it a scientific feel and vibe and a spiritualized. That's what I want to get across to you. He has spiritualized the idea of progressivism, that it's part of your destiny, and you're bringing destiny to pass. And if only you will be involved in the flow of history. If you stand in the way, you're a problem. You're of the past. And by definition, old things are standing in the way. That was an old conflict. We don't even want to talk to you. You're irrelevant. What matters now are the ideas in conflict we must push forward. It's a compelling idea. Be sure you don't get infected with it. Be sure that you look to the now, the objective truths that are revealed now in nature, that are now revealed. And that's what our courts do to address injustice. They may not do it well, but thankfully there's courts of appeal. But we must look now to the laws of our nation now. They've been altered greatly by the Roe v. Wade decision, which was a progressive dismissal of the right to life, that was old-fashioned values. The fact is the right to life is based on self-evident truths right now. And if you want to address truth and what's really real, you have to deal with things right now, and you can. So I want to remind you in the battle, I know we've spent some time now in philosophy and the dangers of it. There are so many aspects in the spiritualization of progressivism that takes a lot of Christians. A lot of religious people are seduced. As I said, read Pope Pius X, who's addressing the Roman Catholic Church, and he said, you've been seduced by progressivism, by modernity. And that is the idea, we're going to bring modern times to pass. We're going to make things happen. We're part of the destiny of mankind. And that's a seductive lie. So watch what you let in your mind, think things through, look at objective facts, and when it comes to the right to life, we present what's objectively true, why we must protect those that can't protect themselves. Why this matters, because it's the very foundation of all of our other freedoms.
Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life. Wherever you are in the nation, you can find out more at National Right to Life. You can find vital pro-life information and also find the access to your state and local Right to Life affiliate. Get informed and get involved.